Thank you for joining us and braving the roads. Today we have Jesika Reimer joining us. She works for the University of California, Davis, and also Tega Wildlife Research. And I'm going to pass it over to Jessica. She can talk a little bit about that.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me tonight, guys. I'm an associate research specialist at University of California, Davis, as well as the owner and lead ecologist of Taiga Wildlife Research, which focuses on studying bats at northern latitudes. And prior to that, I spent 8 years in Anchorage at the Alaska Center for Conservation Science, which is a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And so it's been really fun. It's probably been close to about 15 years of studying bats in the north. I would say I am a bat biologist, but really it's what they're doing in these kind of extreme environments and at these high latitudes that really interests me. So I started my work in northern Canada, up in the Northwest Territories, and then in 2013 moved over to Anchorage and spent the last 10 years studying bats throughout Alaska. And so even though I'm based in Northern California now, all of my work still occurs in the north, and in particular, I still do a lot of bat work in Alaska. So it's fun to be able to be here and share kind of some of the things that we've learned over the last decade, I guess. So let me see here, make sure we're working. All right. So what I want to talk about tonight is we're going to talk a little bit about bat basics, bats of the world. Why are they cool? What sort of diversity? Why do we care? And then we'll move over into Alaska and we'll talk about what they do in the summer. What species are here? When are they here? How have they adapted to these kind of environments in these high northern latitudes? They hibernate. We have very long winters. They're nocturnal. In the summer, we have 24-hour daylight. So how are they able to adapt their behavior to be able to thrive in these areas? And then we'll talk a little bit about bats in the winter, what they're doing in the winter in Alaska. That's always the big question we get, is where do they go? We don't have all the answers for that, but over the last probably decade, we've been chipping away at that answer slowly but surely. And so I'll talk a bit about the work that we've been doing with that recently. So bats are, for those of you who remember your grade 1 science class, bats are the only group of flying mammals, so capable of true flight. And because they're mammals, that means that they're warm-blooded, they have fur, they give birth to live pups, and they produce milk. So there's a lot of investment that goes into their young as well as their own personal maintenance. And so when people hear that I study bats, a lot of the time, they will say that is gross. They're like flying rodents. And so I get that. A lot of people don't like them so much. And when you look at this, you can see that, they are small and furry like a mouse, and they do have wings. But what we know about small rodents and mammals in general is the smaller you are, typically you're relatively short-lived. So mice live to be 1 to 2 years old, and they typically reproduce relatively quickly. So they'll have, 10, 20, 30 babies in the summer. So they live fast and they live furious. Whereas when we think about mammals on the other end of the size scale, like bears, they live relatively long lives, so 20 to 30 years, and they reproduce relatively slowly. And that seems to be like this kind of common trend across mammals. Smaller you are, shorter lived, reproduce quickly. Larger you are, longer lived, reproduce slowly. But bats are this really interesting piece here. So this is a little brown myotis, which is what we have in interior Alaska. And the oldest known recapture in the wild we have records for is 36 years old. So they live really long lives for their size, so 35 to 40 years old, and they reproduce relatively slowly. So they only have one pup per year, and that's only if they're in good enough body condition when they come out of hibernation to do so. So what we like to say is that bats are more like flying grizzly bears rather than flying mice. And so bats belong to a group called Chiroptera, which literally translates to mean hand wing. And you can see here, you got the human hand, thumb, and 4 fingers. It's the same with the bat. So they have a free thumb, and then they have a membrane stretched out between their 4 fingers that then goes down to their ankle. And that free thumb gives them a lot of maneuverability. And having those kind of movable fingers means that they have a lot of maneuverability in flight. So birds you see kind of soaring and flapping. Bats, if you watch them fly, they're a lot more erratic and a lot more, flighty, because they just are able to move that much quicker and respond kind of quick turns more so than birds. The group Chiroptera is a really large, diverse group. So globally, they're on every continent except for Antarctica. There's no food, there's no roosts, so there's no reason for them to be there. But across the globe, there are over 1,400 different species. So there are a lot more species and diversity than people typically think of when they think of bats. They come in all sorts of different sizes, and so we can have really small bats like the bumblebee bat, which is the size these are in Vietnam. They're the size of your thumb, the tip of a thumb. Or you can have really large bats like these Malaysian fruit bats, which are like the size of a toddler with wings or a medium-sized dog with wings. They can come in all sorts of different colors. And so we have yellow bats, orange bats, white bats, silver bats, spotted bats, brown bats, and they come in all sorts of different shapes. So this is on the top left, you have the mohawk bat. The spotted bat has really large ears. You've got bats with really big eyes and tiny ears, bats with really big ears and tiny eyes, and things like the hammerhead bat, which I don't know why they have a nose like that, but usually the way a bat looks, its color, its shape, its size can tell us a lot about where they live and what they eat. And so all these 1,400 different species of bats, there's different groups that tend to specialize and eat different things. So we have frugivorous bats, and so typically these bats have really large noses for smelling fragrant fruit, really large eyes for seeing the really bright colors, and they don't necessarily need big ears for listening to things, so they really put a lot of emphasis into that nose and eyes. We also have nectivorous bats, and so they have really long tongues to get the nectar down in flowers. They have really long, narrow noses so they can get their faces in the flowers. And as you can imagine from seeing the pollen on this guy's face here, they're really important for pollinating. So similar to butterflies, moths, bumblebees, they're really important for pollinating plants. And the frugivorous bats are really important for seed dispersal in forests. So bats that belong to these two groups are really essential for forest propagation for crops. Things like bananas, agave plant, better known as tequila. We also have bats that are piscivorous, so they specialize on fish. And these bats have really, really large feet that they troll through the water and grab the fish out of the water. We also have a group of bats that are carnivorous, so amphibians, small mammals, birds. They have huge teeth. I've worked with these bats down in Belize, and huge teeth, big faces, because they're really getting in there and getting those small prey items. We also have sanguinivorous bats, better known as vampire bats. These guys, you'll often hear in the movies, I want to suck your blood, and vampires just suck your blood. But these guys are really cool. Their two front teeth here, you would think that they suck blood from fangs, but that's not actually how they work. These two little front teeth here, they'll go to their prey, they'll make two little tiny, like paper cut sized cuts, and then they have an anticoagulant in their saliva. So they put this saliva into the cut, and it means that the blood won't clot. So the blood just keeps running, running, running. They lap it up with their tongue like a kitten drinking milk, and they will get so full that they can't actually fly back to their roost. So you'll see them waddling back from their prey back to their cave to get back for the night. So of all of those 1,400 different species, only 3 of them specialize in blood, and 2 of them prey primarily on birds. And so a lot of people seem to have a fear of vampire bats. I would say, they're very small. There's only 3 species of them. They're only in the tropics, and 2 of them don't want anything to do with you. They're just going to prey on birds. The last group of bats that we have, we call insectivorous bats. And so these bats are ones that prey on insects, and they have relatively small eyes compared to those fruit bats, but they have really, really big ears. And those big ears are used to listen for insects, but also because they use echolocation. So echolocation is a type of sonar. So they send out a call and they listen for it to come back to gain information from that returning call. So similar to dolphins and whales and submarines. So you can think of it kind of as if a sound wave was like a basketball. If you throw it at a wall that's really close to you, it's going to come back really fast. If you throw it at a wall that's really far away, it's going to come back really slowly. So the rate at which that call comes back can tell you a lot about the distance to the object. If you bounce that ball on a tile floor versus a carpeted floor, the way it comes back is going to be very different. So you can tell a lot about the texture of the object that you're bouncing off of and that's in front of you. And if you bounce that ball directly at the wall versus into a corner that comes back wonky, you can tell a lot about what direction and what shape that item is. And so that's how bats use echolocation to navigate, as well as to hunt their prey, find their prey, and then hunt their prey. The really cool thing about this echolocation is it's a really high frequency, so we as humans can't hear it, but we have equipment that can record it, the sound, and lower it to a frequency we can hear, as well as show us sonographs. And the cool thing about these calls is we can put our detectors, passively record, and we can learn a lot about what bats are in the area and what are they doing. So different species forage in different areas, so high clutter or low clutter, so in the forest or maybe wide open spaces, and they're eating different things across different species. And so here on the top, we have a pallid bat, and this is a sonograph of what their echolocation call looks like. So we have frequency up on the left here and duration on the bottom. So you can see that the pallid bat has a really steep call, so their call covers a lot of frequency range, and it's really, really fast. And this species is known to hunt in very cluttered forested areas, and they eat little things. And so they need information really rapidly. So their calls are really fast and a wide range of really high frequencies because they bounce back really quickly. Whereas if you look at the bottom here, this is a hoary bat. They're much larger species. They're in wide open spaces and they eat really large things. And so their calls are much lower in frequency, a much smaller range, and a lot longer with more duration between each call. So you can kind of think of it as like FM radio. It's lower, it goes out slower, it comes back slower, which is fine for this species because they're in a wide open space. So they don't need that rapid information. They would rather get more information from a longer distance. So by using this acoustic recordings, we can tell what species are in the area, when are they there, and we can tell a lot about what they're doing. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on here. So bats in Alaska, what do we have? We don't have 1,400 species, no vampire bats, but we do have 7 different species of bats, and we've confirmed this through capture records as well as through the acoustics that I just mentioned. And so in Alaska, we have 2 migratory species. So we have the hoary bat and we have the silver-haired bat. And these are species that are known to migrate up in the spring. So they follow the warm weather and good food up in the spring. And then when things start to take a turn, like it sounds like they're doing in Alaska right now, these species retreat to the south where they follow the food and warm weather farther south. So they're active year round, but they're snowbirds. They're not going to be in Alaska for the summer. The hoary bat, they're wide ranging, and so they're from South America all the way up to North America. And the silver-haired bat, limited to North America, but they're pretty wide ranging throughout the continent. So in addition to those 2 migratory species, we have 5 what we call resident species. These all belong to the group Myotis, little brown Myotis, long-legged Myotis, Puma Myotis, California Myotis, and the western long-eared Myotis. And Myotis seems to represent small, brown, eats bugs. So while they all look really similar, they definitely fill different niches in the environment. The western long-eared Myotis is an old-growth forest specialist. The little brown Myotis that we'll talk a lot about tonight is more of a generalist, and they're found all throughout Alaska. And then each of the other species have their preferences for roost, forage type, and where they're active. The California Myotis on the right-hand side actually are active all year long. They're active throughout the winter, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so in Alaska, where do we find guys? Well, this pink range map, this is really where we find little brown Myotis. So Myotis lucificus, they're the only species we find in interior Alaska. And the remaining 6 species are all found in southeast Alaska, so that highlighted orange. And where the limit, kind of that western limit of where they range, is still a little unknown. Through the acoustic work that we've done, we've documented them in Skagway, Yakutat, I believe silver-haired bats have been documented in Cordova as well. But where this kind of range limit is still a little bit of an unknown for us. We know kind of Kodiak, Kenai, Anchorage is all just little brown. It's the only species we document there. And last summer we were out in Valdez to kind of do some acoustic work to say, are there other species here? Where is that western range limit? we only saw little browns, but by doing long-term monitoring in those sites, we're going to be able to better understand the range extent of these species from southeast. And as the climate is changing and summers are getting longer and spring is arriving earlier, we're hoping to be able to document if some of these species start moving up farther up into Alaska. So let's talk about bats in the summer. Bats in the summer, I'm going to focus mainly on Myotis leucivicus. That's what we've done a lot of work on in both Alaska and northern Canada. And so again, this species is very wide ranged. They're generalists. They can really adapt really well to different environments, prey availability. They are a winter hibernator. In the summer, all females will form large groups, and they seem to love buildings. And so we'll have hundreds of female bats will leave their winter hibernation site. They'll move into a building. It's safe. It's warm. It's a great place to have their pup in a protected area. They'll be there for a few months in the summer while their pups are growing and learning how to hunt. And then in the fall, they'll leave the building roost and they'll head to the winter hibernation site. And in the eastern US and in Northwest Territories, where I've worked in northern Canada, we see this species of bat using large cave sites like this. And so it seems to be a large mouth. It's often karst topography, and you drop down into these large caverns. Usually there's snow on the ground, unlike this photo, but they're these really large spaces where thousands and thousands of bats are spending the winter in these warm, stable environments. And then they will come out in the spring, go to their summer sites before returning to their caves in the fall. So when we think about bats in Alaska and in the north in general, there's a couple of challenges that come to mind, and I'm sure some of them have already popped into your head. So we know that throughout Alaska, we have a much shorter summer season than we do in the lower 48. So I'm now based out of Northern California, even though all my research is still in the north. And I'm amazed that we have equal parts summer and winter here in California, where I grew up in Northern Canada, and having lived in Alaska for so long, summer's a couple months and then, we're on to it and we love winter. So when we think about bats surviving at these high latitudes, the first thing that comes to mind is the summer when they're active is a very short season. So they have a very limited amount of time in order to gather resources for their own long survival. Remember, they're long-lived species, as well as to invest in their pups. And again, remember, live birth, they're producing milk. It's very energetically expensive. So they need enough resources to be able to support their survival and the survival of their young. In addition to those short summer seasons, we also, during that summer period, have really short summer nights. And so especially as you move farther north, places like Fairbanks and farther, in some areas we have 24-hour daylight. And so you've taken the short summer season, and for a nocturnal mammal, you've created an even greater time crunch during those summer nights. And so when we think about time as a resource in terms of availability of them being able to go out and forage and hunt prey, it's really limited at these northern latitudes. And in addition to that, temperatures are often much cooler as well. And so these bats, little brown myotis, they prey on aerial insects. So these are insects that are flying around. And we find that at cooler temperatures, insects aren't flying anymore. And so with cooler temperatures, the prey availability just isn't there for them. So when we first started doing work in the north, we had a lot of questions about, are they able to survive at these northern latitudes, or do we see them as sink populations where maybe, there are bats there, but it's not really viable, and a little bit farther south is a much warmer, cushier place for them to be? So we had a lot of questions, and we'll dive right into those. So when I started working at Alaska Center for Conservation Science, we started a bat monitoring program where we were working with homeowners who had bats in their buildings. And so all of these dots on the blue dots on the map, sorry, indicate maternity colonies that we've worked with starting in 2016. So we started with 6 colonies, expanded out to, I believe, 12, and now I think we're upwards of over 30 colonies that we work at and homeowners that we work with. So maternity colonies, as I mentioned, love to use buildings in the summer. And so at each of these sites, we know there's bats in the buildings. We put out acoustic recorders. You can kind of see the microphone here sticking out at the building. And so we can do some passive monitoring. We just have to change batteries. We collect the data at the end of the summer and can tell a lot about when the bats are there and what they're doing. And then we also do active monitoring. And so we'll do an emergence count to figure out how many bats are in the roost. And then we'll do capture events where we look at how healthy are the bats. And each bat gets fitted with a small metal band, you can see here, with a unique identifier number on it. And so the bats, if they're captured again in future years, we can know a lot about their longevity. We can know if they were reproductive both years or 3 years whenever they're captured. And we have some, we're just looking through records now that we have captured 11 years after the first year that we captured them. So we're able to get some really cool long-term data using that data. So throughout this work and working with homeowners and seeing, the buildings that the bats are using, we kind of documented all sorts of buildings that they were using, all sorts of sizes, everything from large inhabited everyday houses to really small kind of vacation rental cabins to abandoned barns. And what we were able to see is, how big are the colonies in Alaska? And what we're seeing is that colony sizes are anywhere from 10 to over 500 bats. And the size of the roost doesn't seem to dictate how many are in there. See that I'm not going to tell you where that cabin is because because you might not want to go vacation there anymore. But there's over 400 bats in that attic, and it's a really warm, stable, amazing environment for the little browns maternity colony throughout the summer there. Whereas we have really large, this big barn, which in the lower 48 is typically great habitat, and we have really small colonies there. So we have a wide range of buildings that they're using, and a wide range of sizes of colonies. And so using the acoustic data at these sites, are very healthy and reproductive. And so it seems like Alaska has a good population and an environment that can support a healthy population. So it's not a sink of just some random few bats here and there, but we do have a very healthy population of little brown bats, especially throughout the interior. And by the acoustic work that we did, we were able to start looking at season length and when they're here during the summer. And so what this graph is showing is the blue represents the number of acoustic calls or passes that we recorded each night over the 3 years that we did this study. And so that's, the higher the peak, the more bat activity there was. The green represents, let's see here, average minimum nightly temperature. And so it shows you in the spring it's relatively cool. Obviously, it gets warmer in the summer and then drops down in the fall. And then the diamonds represent the date of thaw and the date of freeze. And what we wanted to look at again was the season length. So typically, bats aren't active, little brown bats aren't active on the landscape unless it's warmer than 10 degrees Celsius. And so that's this line right here. And so you can see that we have a lot of bat activity before that. So when it's cooler than 10 degrees Celsius in the spring and later in the fall as well. So it's telling us that bats are not limited by a really short season. They're actually active at cooler temperatures to kind of expand that season out to have more time to gather the resources that they need. And so what's cool about this acoustic work is we can look at the trends in the data and we can say that, here we see that bats start arriving at maternity colonies early April. We see that throughout May and June, the female bats have moved in and are active and foraging and likely, growing their pup. They're pregnant. They're growing their fetus. Then we see a huge spike in activity by mid to late July, and that usually indicates that the pups have started to fly. And so the pups we think it's about 2 to 3 weeks from birth to being able to fly and forage on their own. And so, lots of pups flying around means more calls on the landscape. So we're able to pick that acoustic signature out. We see that, by mid to late August, the activity starts decreasing. So bats are moving out from their summer sites. The pups are foraging on their own. They're flying. They start moving towards their winter sites. And by early October, we no longer observe bats on the landscape. But what this is telling us is that for little brown bats, we don't know where they spend the winter in interior Alaska. But by looking at this acoustic data that shows us that they're here very early in the spring and they remain very late in the fall, it suggests to us that they're likely spending the winter locally. So while we still need to find those roost sites, this is kind of the first step in us saying we do think they're staying locally, where traditionally the thought was that they were migrating farther south for the winter. They are known to do small-scale migrations, even though they're not considered a migratory species. But again, this acoustic data suggests that they are actually staying locally. So this gives us a good idea of the seasonal data, but we wanted to also look at, again, night length. We talk about that limited summer season, but within that summer, we want to look at, are they limited by night? And so here are kind of the same data for one of these, for a roost site around Anchorage. And all of these blue dots are basically a bat call. That's when we recorded a bat call. And here's kind of season along the bottom, and the blue represents sunset and the red sunrise. And you can see that all of the bat activity is really limited to after sunset and before sunrise. So even though the nights are really short at this latitude, the bats still seem to remain relatively nocturnal. They really like that true night. So it seems like there's a lot of pressure keeping them truly nocturnal despite the short night. But as we move farther north, I was really interested in seeing, is there a point where the nights are just too short and they just need, they need to come out outside of true night? And what we see, and this is a site around Fairbanks, so 64 degrees latitude, and you can see that right around solstice, bats start coming out before sunset, and they stay out after sunrise. And so around solstice at 64 degrees latitude anyway, it seems like it's just not quite enough time. This is right before they're about to give birth, and so there's a big energetic requirement. They need that food, and so they seem to be willing to forage outside of that true night. But you can see here, as soon as the nights get long enough again, they revert back to being nocturnal. And so there seems to be some very strong pressure pushing them towards remaining nocturnal when possible. And from what we've seen in the field anecdotally, it seems like predation is really that pressure force that's causing them to stay nocturnal. The brighter it is outside, the higher chances of them being predated upon. So we've looked at season length, we've looked at within a night, but I also mentioned we can look at what they're doing. So how are they able, with such a short amount of nightly time, able to gather the resources they need for their own survival, winter hibernation, and giving birth to their pups? Well, we can again look at that acoustic data, and this is kind of just a simple graph that shows, this is kind of what a bat pass might look like. So random pulses out into the environment we like to call a search phase. So they're just passing through, they're just seeing what's out there. They'll increase the number of pulses and how rapid they come out and their frequency range when they find an object and they start tracking it. We call that the track phase. And then at the very end, as they come in to capture their prey, we have what we call a terminal buzz. And so we can look at each of these acoustic calls in a given night to look at how successful are they at capturing insects in a given night. So using some of these data, what we were able to do was this graph shows just activity throughout the season. So during pregnancy, lactation, when pups start flying, and then post-lactation or pre-hibernation when they're putting on their fat. And similar to that blue graph I showed, it's pretty stable activity levels. We see an uptick when there are more bats on the landscape because those pups are flying. And then, it stays pretty elevated until they go into hibernation. But when we look at those same calls and say, but what is their foraging efficiency, or how often are they capturing insects within those nights, we see something like this. And so we see that during pregnancy, fledging, and getting ready for hibernation, foraging efficiency stays about the same. They're catching about the same amount of bugs. But during lactation, which is this time when they need a lot of energy to produce milk, we see that the number of feeding buzzes in those calls is way higher. So it seems like they're encountering insects more readily, and they're foraging a lot faster. So one of the ways they may be able to get around that, there's only so much night for them to forage in, is just we know there's a lot of insects in Alaska. It's a very good breeding ground. And so similar to birds that migrate up to Alaska for that food source, it seems like bats are also able to capitalize on that increased food source. And so one more thing about their feeding is we wanted to say, we saw, okay, they're limited by night, but they seem to be foraging faster, but are they actually getting more calories? And so we did a study out of Wrangell St. Elias where we drew blood and we looked at beta hydroxybutyrate levels. And basically all you need to know is that just means caloric intake. So basically the higher the level, the more calories they consume that night. And what these bars show you is the blue is summer reproductive period for a site in Ontario, so much farther south, and the pink is the fall period. And so at this site in Ontario, they're consuming the same number of calories throughout the summer and as they're getting ready for fall. They don't seem to be limited in how many calories they're consuming. When we look at the data for Alaska and the Wrangell-St. Elias area, you can see our data here. It seems like during the summer reproductive period, they are gaining a lot more calories than bats farther south. So again, we saw that with the feeding buzz data, they're eating a lot faster and it seems to be translating to more calories. But we also see that in the fall period, again, much higher caloric intake. And we didn't see higher feeding buzz rates there. And so it raised the question of, well, what are they doing? How are they able to still maintain a really high caloric intake without foraging faster than what we're seeing elsewhere? and so they're foraging really fast during the fall or during the summer. But what we saw when we started looking at their diet is that they're actually foraging on spiders. So if you recall, I mentioned that little brown myotis, they're aerial hawkers, so they like to grab insects out of the air. And when the temperatures are cool, aerial insects aren't active. And so during this fall period, when they're trying to put on fat for the winter and aerial insects aren't around, we see that they actually switch their diet to be consuming spiders, big, juicy, very caloric rich spiders. So they're they're able to be active at much cooler temperatures to get around this idea of a short summer season. They do seem to be limited by that short summer night, but at those high latitudes, they're willing to push it. But during those short summer nights, they're able to forage faster, they're able to forage differently, and that allows them to remain active and use the time available to them during those colder summer temperatures. So those are some of the kind of the big things that we first started discovering about how are they able to do it? How are little brown bats able to live at these high latitudes? And I mentioned that, these maternity colonies are in buildings. And so one of the things that I heard a lot when I first started working in Alaska is that bats are only in interior Alaska because there's human buildings. And so they wouldn't be here because they're so limited on time and resources, is probably because there's buildings here that give them that extra edge and that extra, warmth and protection that allows them to be at these higher latitudes. And so we did a study where we went and asked, well, okay, let's look at bats in the Arctic. Are they urban obligates or are they urban exploiters? And this was a study that was done with Kim Yokin's crew with DOD, as well as my crew at Alaska Center for Conservation Science. And so a bit of terminology here is an urban exploiter is basically this idea that a species can capitalize on the availability of human resources, but they don't need it. They're generalists, they're really adaptable, like pigeons in an urban park getting fed by kids every day, bats using buildings, rats eating grains on ships. We know of these species that are able to exploit human resources to better themselves, but they don't need them. Whereas we also have urban obligates. And this is the idea of species that rely on human provided resources for survival outside of their normal natural range. And so we see this with red fox on the North Slope. They're able to survive in Arctic fox territory, even though they don't have the same skills as the Arctic fox, because they're eating food at oil camps or mining camps. So they able to capitalize on resources that are available because humans are there. And so one of the ideas was that, well, bats are just in interior Alaska because human dwellings are there, and so the reproductive colonies can have success there. And when we think about, kind of across North America and South America, I guess, we think about urban development and this idea of, again, are these little brown bats just exploiting what's available to them, or do they really need the structures to go there? And so what we did for this study was we used radio telemetry. So you can see a little tag on the back of the little brown bat here, and you can see the tag coming off his back there. These are small radio transmitters that emit a beep or a pulse that we can pick up with antennas. And the tags fall off after about 2 or 3 weeks. So they're not permanent. We can follow them for a short amount of time and learn a lot about where they're going and where they're roosting. And so we tagged a bunch of bats at building maternity colonies, expecting that we would see, how many buildings are they using? And when we first started following them around, we actually ended up tracking them to trees. And when we counted how many bats came out of each of those trees, you can see on the left here, we had 94 bats emerge from this tiny little crack here, and we had 84 bats emerge from this broken cottonwood here. And so to us, you know, when spoiler here is when we think about are they exploiters or obligates, I think we would argue that they're actually just exploiters. That little brown bats would be in interior Alaska regardless. Having buildings and houses is really helpful for them to raise their young, but not necessary. So we're pretty sure they were here long before human dwellings were, and they have just learned how to exploit the resources that we present to them. So that's bats in the summer. So let's talk about bats in the winter. And so I feel like this is always a big thing people are really interested in because we do have these really cold, long winters. So what are they doing? We talked about those species that migrate, and so they just get out of here and they head south. But little brown myotis, as well as the other myotis in Southeast Alaska, are known to hibernate. And so little brown myotis, typically this is a cave site that we have in northern Canada. You can see my field tech, Julian, crawling out of the mouth there. Lots of snow and ice. This was middle of June, so it was still pretty cold around there. And when you go down into these caves, it opens up into about a two-story building, and they're about maybe like a soccer field wide, and it's 6 or 7 chambers of these. And when you look into the walls or into the cracks, you'll see these large clusters of bats all clustered up on the wall. They're hibernating, so they've dropped their metabolic rates really low to conserve energy, and they're just matching the temperature of the cave. So large caves remain relatively stable, 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, and so the bats are able to lower their metabolic rates, save energy, hibernate, and just stay in these kind of warm sorts of environments. And so in Alaska, like I mentioned, we have little brown bats in the interior, but we don't know where they spend the winter. So we're going to travel down into Southeast Alaska and focus on this area where we do know little brown bats are hibernating. So this is work that was done by Karen Blavis, who's with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game down in Juneau, as well as Tori Rhodes, who's a recent graduate student who's also a biologist in that area. And so what Karen did was she attached those radio transmitters to little brown bats and hiked around, flew a plane around, and followed these bats around in the fall to find out where they were going, which is incredibly difficult. These bats are so small, we don't have GPS technology and to put on them yet, so we have to physically be within 3 miles of them to track them and find where they're going. And so what Karen found was they were actually roosting in cracks and crevices similar to what this rock is here. And so when she tagged these bats and followed them to these sites, she put out trail cameras so she could then observe for the rest of the season bats coming and going. And what she would see is bats entering in the fall in very small groups, 2 to 5 bats, and then she would catch them on the video coming out again in the spring. So she confirmed the first kind of overwintering sites for little brown bats in Alaska. And so a lot of Tori's work that she's just wrapping up now is using scent dogs. So you can see Colette and Jack, who are with Rogue Detection Teams, which is a conservation canine unit, which is really cool work. We were out there on Admiralty, and we used Jack to sniff for bats, but not just find bats that are there, because it's their winter site, and it was in the middle of the summer. So the bats aren't actually there, and it's a winter site. So they're not defecating, they're not urinating, there's not a lot of smell. So we were asking Jack, the dog, to just find a place that bats sort of sometimes touch down on. And he actually did pretty amazing. And so using the scent dog, they've been able to identify a lot more of these overwintering sites and again, further just confirm that little brown bats, at least a portion of the population, is spending the winter in Southeast Alaska. So that's one species, but I said that we have 5 resident species in that area. So a project that Karen and I recently worked on was using acoustic data throughout the winter to see if we could pick up any other species of bats. And so all of these sites on the map here are all acoustic monitoring sites that Karen developed over a 10-year period. And so we had 77 sites. We had those acoustic recorders out for 10 years, and we looked at the data from December, January, and February. So this is a time when bats should be hibernating, so we wouldn't expect a lot of activity on the landscape. But we do know that bats are active within their cave roost sites, and they do that to raise their immune system. They do it for mating as well as to get water. And we do know that bats that aren't in large caves, but are maybe in smaller roosting winter sites, they are active on the landscape occasionally. And they do that to find water, to find food, to maybe change their roosts if the weather's changing, as well as if they're disturbed from disease. So we should expect potentially to pick up some winter bats, which would then confirm their presence throughout the winter and hibernation in the area. So previous studies that we looked at before we started this work was we know that the California myotis has been recorded by various studies through in the winter, being active all along the west coast, as far north as Haida Gwaii in northern BC. Silver-haired bats, they've been documented as far north as northern Washington during the winter. And little brown bats, even though we know they're spending the winter all along the west coast, they're not picked up at all. And that's really because there are these wannabe species that like to go into their cave site and they don't want to come out until the spring when they know there's food available for them. So when we looked at all of our data from those 77 sites, what we saw was 99% of the calls that we recorded were attributed or identified as California myotis. So we know that California myotis are spending the winter in the area and are actually quite active in Southeast Alaska throughout the winter, despite it being winter. Um, we also documented silver-haired bats to a much lesser degree, but we did confirm that they are also active in the area. And little brown bats, 10 years of data, 77 sites. We only had 8 files, 8 passes that we could identify as little brown myotis. So we know they're spending the winter there. They just do not like to be active during the winter. And so when we look at these sites and see kind of where they were mostly active, we see something like this. So we see Myotis californicus, they're active, or California myotis, they're active around Juneau, on Admiralty, and then we have these huge activity hotspots. So the size of the circle represents how many calls we picked up in a given night. Um, we see we have a lot of activity in Sitka, and to us, this suggests that not only are they just moving roosts or maybe looking for water, but we might actually have a winter foraging site in the Sitka area for this species. When we look at silver-haired bats, you can see kind of these orange dots are much smaller than the Californicus, but they're also quite spread out. So again, this suggests to us that it's not just one or two bats that are hanging out for the winter, but there's a good portion of the population that is spending the winter in Alaska or in Southeast Alaska. And then again, Myosispicus, we know they're hibernating around Juneau, so getting a couple calls there is not surprising. But we did get calls in Gustavus as well as Sitka. So this kind of gives us a little treasure map to say, we have confirmed winter sites in Juneau and on Admiralty, but this gives us a little bit of a new kind of target to say, if we've picked up calls in these other areas, it may be a place to go with scent dogs or with other means to try and find where they're spending the winter elsewhere. So that their winter range seems to be much greater than just the Juneau area. So this study was really cool in confirming that Californicus as well as silver-hairs are overwintering in Southeast Alaska and hibernating in the area, but also that Californicus are staying quite active throughout the winter. So we don't know where they're hibernating in interior Alaska yet, but through that acoustic work, we're able to say we're pretty sure they're staying locally, and then through this acoustic work, we're able to say we have these other species that are staying locally as well. So we still have lots of questions, but we're starting to get there. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about, and this is the little more depressing part of the talk, it's the why should we care? And I know all of you probably love bats now and are like, just because they're cool, that's why we want to know all of this information. But one of the big reasons that has spurred and funded a lot of this research is the arrival of a fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which causes a disease called white nose syndrome. Some of you may have heard of it. It's not in Alaska yet, so it may not be on your radar, but it's basically a fungus that grows on the bats while they're hibernating in their cave sites. This fungus likes the same conditions that the bats like for hibernation, so they seem to overlap in their range a lot. And so this fungus will grow on the bats. If left unchecked, it will cause major tissue damage and eat holes in the wings. And so what it actually does is, in order to combat the fungus, the bats will come out of hibernation. So they're still in their cave, but they'll come out of torpor. So they'll come awake. They'll raise their immune system and their metabolic rate so they can groom the fungus off of themselves so that they don't end up with these massive holes. The problem is that these are really small bats, and they fly. So they're not like bears that can just pack on a ton of weight and roll into a cave in the fall to hibernate all winter. These bats can only carry so much weight, so they're really limited on what their reserves are. And so what we see, sorry, this is going to get a little gruesome, but what we see in caves that are infected is that the bats will arouse during the winter. They've used up all of their fat reserves, and they'll try to leave the cave site. So you can see here, this is a biologist with USGS finding all these dead bats outside of the cave, or in the spring we'll go in the caves and the floor will be littered with dead bodies. And so it has a 90% mortality rate for bats in an infected cave, which means, if there's 10,000 bats in a cave and the fungus arrives, 9,000 of those bats will be dead the next spring. So it's really devastating. It's been wreaking havoc, from the east coast to the west, and we've been scrambling to try to figure out what to do with it. In the early days, it was, what is this? How is it actually killing the bats? And now we've gotten to a point where it's, how can we monitor for its arrival and what impact will it actually have on the populations we have? So this fungus, a bit of backstory, it landed in New York. It came over from Europe in 2006. Within the first 5 to 10 years, it had spread all the way out, to that Midwest there. In 2016, it landed in Washington. It made this massive jump, which we weren't expecting, which really spurred a lot of our monitoring at maternity colonies. Because we don't know where they spend the winter and we don't have these large cave sites where we can look for the fungus, monitoring bats at their summer maternity colonies and being able to do annual counts is our best bet at being able to monitor if the fungus arrives. And then we'll see that in mass mortalities or colonies not returning during the summer. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of monitoring for the fungus. And it's just kept continuing to spread out from there. The good news is it's not in Alaska yet. From what we know from where the bats are hibernating in southeast Alaska in those really small groups in those small cracks and crevices, it seems to suggest we may not see the same mass mortality that we saw in the east with large caves with thousands of bats in them. So we're hoping that it's limited in its spread and its impact, but it's still uncertain at this point. Um, and the final good news is that in New York, where it landed in 2006, we're starting to see populations rebound. Because they're long lived and really slow reproducing species, it's been really slow, but it is seeming really promising in that we are seeing populations rebound. So in short, I hope you've learned a bit about bats in general, bats of the world, how diverse they are, and all of the amazing things that they do. We've learned a little about bats here in Alaska in the summer and how they're able to deal with the short summers and short summer nights. And then you now know all the questions we still have about bats in the winter and where they're going. But I think a lot of the work that we do, especially with the monitoring work, we rely a lot on citizen scientists. So if you have bats in your cabin or in your house and you want to know more or you want to help do an emergence count, so we can add your dot to the map to be monitoring populations in the area, we would love to have you join us and help us out with that science. So yeah, please reach out, and yeah, we'd love to have you join us. With that, a lot of people went into, I've worked with over the last decade making this happen. This isn't by any means. It's a lot of homeowners, a lot of technicians, a lot of agencies, a lot of people willing to put out detectors to start answering some of these questions. So we're still nowhere near understanding everything, but we're a lot farther along than we were 10 years ago when we first started this work, and that's pretty exciting.
Does anybody have any questions? I have a question for you, Jessica. How are you capturing the bats?
Yeah, so we use a really fine mist net, so similar to bird captures. It's a really, really fine nylon thread. that's black. And so the bats, because so blind as a bat isn't entirely accurate. They have eyes, they can see, but they do rely primarily on echolocation to navigate, especially at night. And so we use these really fine, we call them mist nets. We string them up in corridors where we know bats are using, and they've got these kind of pockets in them. So the bats will hit the net, drop into a pocket, we'll immediately take them out, take all of our measurements, tag them if we're going to tag them, and then release them from there. So yeah, we use these nets to capture the bats.
So Jessica, we used to have an opportunity to drive surveys here, but
Yeah.
Fish and Game has been doing those for several years. Is there any interest in doing that kind of work again? Or
Yeah, I
monitoring?
believe. Yeah, and so I think it's probably those driving surveys you're talking about that documented the first silver-haired bat in Cordova. So those driving transects are really important. I know Karen Blavis and Tori Rhodes out of Juneau, I believe they're still have detectors they lend out for people to be able to do those driving transects. So the Fish and Game website should have information about that. You're welcome to shoot me an email too, and Christina can share my email address and I can put you in touch with Tori who's running that program. But yeah, as far as I know, there's still interest and those driving transects are happening. And so whenever people are interested, I think they're more than happy to send gear for that. So yeah, if you're interested, that would be super great. I know that work is still going on for sure.
Um, I'm wondering if there's a hypothesis of why the bats in the areas affected by the fungus are rebounding. What?
Yeah, it's really cool, actually. There's a lot of, in the beginning when we started seeing bats returning, the some of the questions were, well, are they just bats coming from other places that see this good habitat, and is it just gonna knock them out as well? So is it acting as a sink, pulling bats in from other uninfected areas to the area? But they did a bunch of banding, so putting that unique ID band on arms, and noticed that it was the same bats year after year. So they were surviving throughout winters of being exposed to the fungus. And what they're finding is that bats that are able to carry more fat are able to survive the white nose disease throughout the winter. So the more reserves you have, the more you're able to wake up during the winter to clean yourself, groom yourself, get rid of the fungus, and drop back into hibernation. So what they're seeing, and I don't know all the technicalities of this, but what I believe they're seeing is fatter bats are surviving, which probably has to do with a slower metabolic rate, so they don't burn fat as fast. So a little bit of they're able to carry more and they don't burn it as fast, so they have more reserves to get them through that winter period. Because we know if bats can survive through the winter and get to their summer grounds, they don't they go to their summer building with the fungus, but within 2 to 3 weeks, they've groomed it all off. They've healed their holes. They're able to reproduce. If they can make it through the winter, they can make it. So we're finding that bats that have a predisposition to be fatter and maintain that fat more are able to survive the fungus.
Cool.
Yeah,
Just,
it's
I
really
have a
exciting.
question. The constraint on foraging during nighttime, and you hinted that that was based on predation pressure. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more on that hypothesis.
Yeah. So so there's a couple of things here. One is that in the interior where we just have little brown bats are typically they forage in open meadows, around beaver ponds, or kind of in wide open spaces. And in northern Canada, where we have many species of bats, so similar latitude, but we have one of the species we have is a northern long-eared bat, and those bats are exclusively in the forest, eating spiders. They're in this really cluttered space. So they fill that niche of that forested habitat, whereas little browns are in this more open meadow space. What we see when we go up into like the Fairbanks area, Wrangell St. Elias area, is there are no other bat species. It's only little browns, and they really restrict their activity to that covered forested habitat. So they seem to really like the cover, which we think is again another way to avoid predation. predation itself, this is super cool. So Karen, when she was doing this radio telemetry work in Southeast Alaska, she was tracked, so she's on the ground, you know, they got the GPS point from a plane, and then during the day she's on the ground and going in to find this bat, and she tracked the tag to an owl pellet. So an owl had eaten the bat and the tag and pooped out the tag. She also tracked another tag to a flap of skin in an owl nest. So from that work, we know that owls are preying on bats. And this past summer, I was in Katmai, and we were doing bat work there, and we were doing an emergence count. So we were standing outside a building, counting the bats as they came out, and about halfway through our count, two big great horned owls, I guess, came in and perched. And right as it got, you know, kind of dusky, they started, and the bats were coming out, they started hunting the bats in front of the roost. So we've seen predation happening, especially from owls. There have been studies that have tried to, you know, use artificial sounds or silhouettes, like those owl silhouettes, to see if they can, you know, influence whether a bat's going to come out of the roost or not. It's really hard to simulate predation for those studies, but anecdotally, we have seen predation. And with that, those graphs I showed you of like kind of Anchorage and the Fairbanks when they're willing to come out in the higher light levels, it just seems like there is a very strong pressure for them to remain nocturnal. And there's probably other parts of that. It's probably prey availability, the things they eat, you know, may come out at dusk rather than being out before dusk. But it seems like predation is our best guess at what the really strong pressure is for them.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Anyone online have a question? All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Jessica. That was a phenomenal talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's so fun to share this, especially like now with Zoom, being able to, yeah, teleport into Cordova is really fun.
Yeah, I appreciate it.